So we have Dr. Tara McAllister here, who is going to talk to us about how biofeedback helps tackle that tricky R. Dr. McAllister, thank you so much for coming today.
Thanks so much for having me. Really happy to be here to talk about this.
Me too. So by the end of this pod course, we hope that you'll be able to list two key findings from the randomized controlled trial on biofeedback for R distortion, identify two features of the staRt app that increase access to biofeedback treatment, define current goals and future directions of biofeedback research, which I'm super excited to learn more about, and then finally describe two viewpoints and similarities in the ongoing debate regarding motor control versus phonological explanations for children's speech patterns. Here's our agenda for today. So we're doing some brief introductions and backgrounds, and then we'll get into the key outcomes of that RCT on the R distortion. We'll talk about the staRt app, and then next steps and research directions in biofeedback treatment, and then the motor versus phonology debate, and then we'll wrap up with some closing remarks and questions. Dr. McAllister, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I am an associate professor in the Department of Communicative Sciences and Disorders at NYU. I was fortunate to recently be named an ASHA Fellow, and I am a linguist turned speech pathologist. So I was in a linguistics PhD program and discovered that linguists don't really get jobs. So I pursued my master's degree in speech pathology and was able to pursue a research agenda that sort of bridges the gap between linguistics and speech pathology. So I'm interested in how speech skill development happens in typical and clinical populations, children and adults. My research on the linguistics side focuses on why developmental speech patterns persist in some children and resolve in others. And then the clinical side of my research is treatment research, asking whether technology enhanced training can improve speech learning in children with speech sound disorders as well as other populations. And then we'll be talking about the staRt app, which is an outgrowth of that research on biofeedback treatment for speech sound disorder. And I currently oversee the team that develops the staRt app.
That's amazing. All of these topics are so interesting. I want to know more about developmental speech patterns and why they resolve in some and not others. So I need to read all of your articles. But thank you again for coming on today. I will give a little bit of background. Most people have heard this podcast, but if you haven't before, if you were coming because Dr. McAllister shared this with you, my name is Vanita Litvak, and I have been an SLP since 2014. I'm the host of this podcast, which is part of the Tassel Learning Network and provides ASHA CEUs. I am the CE content consultant for Tassel, a private practice owner, an adjunct AAC professor, and a student at Northwestern University currently. And funny, my undergrad did not have a speech language pathology program, and somebody told me about the field, and we had a linguistics program. So I was like, well, I'll take a class in linguistics and see what I think. And I loved it. It was mostly about like phonetic transcription and whatnot. And that's when I ended up applying to SLP programs.
Linguistics is fascinating. So many people love linguistics. That's actually why linguists don't get jobs, because there are so many people who are fascinated by the field, and there just aren't enough positions out there, academic positions out there to fill. But communication disorders, speech pathology is a really great outlet for those same interests. And so I've always been sort of a champion of recruiting students from linguistics into the SLP profession, either as clinicians or as researchers.
That's great. Okay, I'll share my disclosures first, and then I'll have you share yours. I have ownership interest in Speechies Site Up and Tassel Learning. And how about you?
So I am a salaried employee of New York University. I am a member of Sonority Labs LLC, which is a commercial entity that was created to explore commercialization of the staRt app. staRt is currently distributed for free, but in the current funding climate, we have to look ahead to a future where we may not be able to sustain grant funding for it. Commercialization is an option that we're exploring. I do receive research funding from the National Institutes of Health and the National Science Foundation, and I receive royalties as an author of the clinical phonetics textbook that was previously published by Pearson, but just released a new edition with Plural Publishers.
Amazing. All right, so let's dive right in. Let's talk about your recent randomized controlled trial on biofeedback intervention for R distortion and what were the findings?
So before I talk about any findings, I just have to shout out to the team because a large-scale randomized control trial is not something that one person could ever do individually. So this research is in collaboration between NYU and collaborators at Montclair State University with Dr. Elaine Hitchcock, as well as Syracuse University with Dr. Jonathan Preston, and a huge team of really talented clinicians, Megan Leese, Robbie Lazarus, Laura Oakes, Megan Matson, a number of different clinicians who are doing the core work in this treatment study. So we have been interested in biofeedback for a long time. Elaine Hitchcock and I published a paper on visual acoustic biofeedback for our distortions back in 2012. And ever since then, we've been conducting small studies, really trying to get at this question of, do we see faster or larger improvements in children with these residual distortions of R when they receive biofeedback compared to traditional treatment? And I should maybe just pause for a second and clarify when we're talking about residual distortions of R, or residual speech sound disorder. RSSD is the term that we use in our papers. So these are kids who may or may not have received speech therapy for other sounds in the past, but right now they're stuck on R. And we actually work with older kids. 9 to 15 was the age group in this randomized control trial. And they're the ones who are considered really challenging to treat. Clinicians have been asking for decades for better ways to get these kids off the caseload. And so we were really interested in the power of biofeedback and visualizing aspects of speech to help those kids get unstuck. So I should also define biofeedback. For me, biofeedback means the use of some form of instrumentation to give a real-time visual display of what's happening during speech. And the core idea is that it's going to give the learner a new window of insight into what speaking entails. We can use different technologies for biofeedback, and in the randomized control trial, as well as in much of our previous research, we focus on two types of biofeedback: ultrasound imaging and visual acoustic biofeedback. So ultrasound imaging is something that I think every SLP would love to have access to. It is just so powerful. You hold a small organ probe underneath the chin and you get a real-time visual display of the shape and movements of the tongue during speech. And it just lets you see inside and know exactly what the child is doing, because if you listen to children distorting the R sound, a lot of the time you don't know what's going on in there. And it's really powerful to be able to see where their tongue is. And then we can also be very specific with them about what needs to change. We can tell them, we teach them what are the different functional parts of the tongue, and we teach them, pull your tongue root back, flatten out your tongue dorsum, and we can get super specific and kind of technical with them because they have that visual piece to anchor on.
Well, first of all, you read my mind because I was going to ask, what is biofeedback? So thank you for checking that box. And then you said that your trial was done with ages 9 to 15. Is there a minimum age that is recommended for using biofeedback?
It's a great question. We do stick with the older kids because they are more consistently responsive to biofeedback, but we have had success with children as young as 6. And there are some published studies out there from a group in Scotland, in particular, Joanne Cullen's team, that has done ultrasound biofeedback with children as young as 4. That's brave.
Okay. Yeah.
But honestly, it's a question of attention more than it is a question of age. Can the child really sit still and attend to this visual display and also be able to divide their attention between what we're telling them and what they're seeing? And some kids at varying ages really struggle with that. But we find that the 8 and up crowd, 9 and up is what we went with for the study, because when you're conducting an efficacy trial, you try to bring in the ideal population for the treatment, and we figured that 9 to 15 was really the ideal population. And then in follow-up research, we'll be interested in expanding to the younger students or children with attention difficulties or other challenges that might complicate the picture.
Okay.
Actually, just to circle back, because I talked about ultrasound biofeedback, but we do have another major type of biofeedback that we study, And I will be spending a bunch of my time talking about it because of the staRt app. But the other type of biofeedback is visual acoustic biofeedback, where instead of showing the child some aspect of their articulation, we give them a visual display of the acoustic signal of their speech. We use a real-time spectrum of speech where the resonant frequencies of the vocal tract appear as peaks in a wave-like shape. And then we tell the learner, okay, every sound has its own shape, and you want to put your peaks in this position for an R sound, so can you change what you're doing and try to get your peaks to line up with the model? And whatever technology we're using, ultrasound, visual acoustic, we're always going to give a visual model. This is what your target looks like. And then we give that real-time display, and the child can play around and try to find a fit between what they're seeing for their own production and the target that we're superimposing on it.
That's amazing. I remember using that visual acoustic feedback, I think in graduate school. I don't remember exactly what the class was, but yeah, I remember using that. I wanted to ask, are you noticing patterns? Like, let's talk about particularly with the ultrasound feedback in these distortions. Do they have similar patterns?
Meaning, are there different sort of types of error shapes, tongue
Yeah.
shapes?
Mhm.
Yeah, actually, so that's a great question because my doctoral student Amanda Eads is currently exploring that question. She has amassed a corpus, a database of multimodal child speech data. It has the acoustic recordings of these are words containing R produced by both by typical children and by children with R distortions, with RSSD affecting R, and ultrasound images and acoustic recordings of those productions. And she is using machine learning methods to ask whether we can find different clusters within that database that correspond with different types of error patterns for R, and then try to map them onto acoustics. So far, she's analyzed the ultrasound data and is finding that there are two different shapes, two major types of error tongue shapes for R, and we're working on adding the audio data. But I would say, just sort of impressionistically, you can definitely make a distinction between kids whose distortion is like an a distortion or a w distortion like wed versus the kids who have a more posterior and tighter like red distortion. And you don't need a machine learning model to hear the difference between a kid who says wed and a kid who says led. So we know that there are different error types out there, and it would be great if this sort of technology development could help clinicians, especially clinicians who are just getting started, who haven't really found their footing for, well, what's the right cue to give if you're hearing a kid whose R is really back and tight versus if they have more of that labial sounding R. If it could give suggested cues for, based on what the acoustic signal is telling us, maybe this is the right way to help that child adjust their articulation.
That's so interesting. What was generalization like without the biofeedback for these children in the trial?
Yeah, so let me actually, I think I wandered a little bit. Let me get back to talking about the program of research on biofeedback. So we had done a number of small scale studies. They were single case experimental designs where each participant acts as their own control. And in each of those studies, we found promising evidence that yes, biofeedback can help support these kids who haven't responded to other forms of treatment for R. But we also know that the gold standard for treatment research is a randomized control trial, a comparison between two treatment conditions across participants. And the hard thing with randomized control trials is that you need a large sample size to be able to detect an effect. And so you need funding. So we were able to secure an NIH grant that allowed us to conduct this 5-year study that treated 108 children. And so the children in that study were randomly assigned either to a traditional treatment condition or to a biofeedback condition. And the biofeedback condition was actually subdivided into the visual acoustic condition, where we use the K-Pentax computerized speech lab Sonomatch software, which may well be the software that you remember using in grad school. It's something that a lot of SLPs are exposed to in grad school, but then don't have after graduation because it's pretty costly. And then the other was the ultrasound biofeedback condition. And just one thing I want to emphasize is that it was important for us that the traditional treatment condition not be like a straw man therapy. We didn't want biofeedback to look good specifically because we were doing a bad job with traditional treatment. And so the traditional treatment condition was structured exactly the same way as the biofeedback treatment condition. And we use the principles of motor learning to think really carefully about what dosage of practice, what's the schedule of feedback, what type of feedback is being provided, like qualitative knowledge of performance feedback versus just correct, incorrect knowledge of results feedback. All of that, we tried to optimize it from everything we had learned in our previous studies. And then the only difference between the conditions was either, yes, they had the real-time feedback, or no, they just had all the cueing and the auditory models, but none of the real-time visual feedback.
Wow, that's all amazing. Did you find that one type of feedback was better than the other?
So, to answer that question, I have to talk about one other aspect of the design of this study, which was that we published two papers. Actually, the second paper was just accepted for publication. Dr. John Preston is the first author on that one. So we divided our analysis into an early phase of treatment, the acquisition phase, and then a second endpoint at the end of all treatment, which was generalization. And the reason we did that is that the principles of motor learning tell us that biofeedback is fundamentally a tool for acquisition. So the principles of motor learning say that really detailed qualitative knowledge of performance feedback is most effective when the learner is just figuring out what they need to do with their articulators to achieve a new sound, a sound that they're not currently producing. And after that new motor pattern has been identified and encoded, and you're just working to generalize it, then actually you want to drop out that really informative feedback and you want to focus on knowledge of results feedback and let the learner pay attention to internal cues. So based on what we were reading in the theory of motor learning, we said, well, we know that we predict an advantage for biofeedback in the early phases, in the acquisition phase, and based on what we're seeing empirically, we think that it continues to be helpful for generalization, except we make a point of fading the biofeedback so that our participants aren't practicing with biofeedback through the whole session. Because if they do, they get really dependent on the visual. And if we take it away, it's amazing how fast they can lose it. You would think, how did you say a perfect R for 8 trials with biofeedback, and then we took it away, and and the kid can totally fall apart. And it's really striking to see that.
That's so interesting.
So that was why we set up the two-part structure in our study, where our primary endpoint was acquisition. That's where we definitely predict an advantage for biofeedback. And then generalization, we think we'll probably still see an advantage, but the theory is less clear on that point. And so the first paper we published, that was the one that came out this fall in JSLHR. That one was looking at the acquisition phase, the first intensive phase of therapy where the clinician had this really interactive back and forth with the client. They were getting in there, they were telling them, okay, try this. Even if there wasn't biofeedback, they were still giving a lot of detailed cues about how to position their tongue. They still had visual aids of pictures of what the tongue should look like, everything that you would have in an evidence-based approach to our treatment, except for the biofeedback. So in that really interactive acquisition phase, we saw that all groups improved, both ultrasound and visual acoustic biofeedback improved, and traditional treatment also improved. But the magnitude of improvement in biofeedback was 2.4 times greater in that early phase of treatment compared to the traditional treatment. And so that was our demonstration that, yes, this theoretically predicted advantage for biofeedback. Biofeedback is a really informative, qualitative form of feedback. As predicted, it does help accelerate progress in the early phase of treatment. And we compared visual acoustic and ultrasound biofeedback in that acquisition phase, and there was no difference between them.
Okay. So that could be like a matter of what's more cost effective for the clinician at some point if this was adopted by more SLPs.
The truth is that unless the pricing on ultrasound changes dramatically, visual acoustic biofeedback is always going to be more accessible than ultrasound biofeedback. And so that sort of practical consideration is always part of our thinking when we talk about biofeedback. But then, so moving on to the secondary outcome of the randomized control trial, which was how do these kids look at the end of all their treatment, we found that there still was a statistically significant advantage for biofeedback treatment compared to traditional treatment. However, at that time point, a difference did emerge between the biofeedback types, with the ultrasound group outperforming the visual acoustic biofeedback group at the generalization time point. And we thought it was really interesting to reflect on what might be driving that difference between the two types. One of the hypotheses that I thought was most compelling is that ultrasound biofeedback isn't only helpful when the client is actively using the ultrasound, it also gives the clinician insight into what the child is doing during their error shapes and also during their closest approximations. This we actually just talked about a moment ago in terms of can we differentiate different error types. And so in the generalization phase of practice, the kids spend a lot of time practicing without biofeedback because, like I said previously, we don't want them to be dependent on it. And one of our hypotheses for the difference between ultrasound and visual acoustic is that in those no biofeedback trials, the clinician in the ultrasound condition knows specifically what's going on both during the kids' error tongue shapes and during their closest approximations, and that may have made their traditional cueing, their non-biofeedback cueing, more effective compared to visual acoustic biofeedback. And that's part of why we're pursuing work like what my student Amanda Eads is doing to try to infer tongue shapes and see if we can infer tongue shapes from the acoustic signal and see if we can see inside the mouth as if we had ultrasound, even though we know that ultrasound is not going to be in the hands of every SLP anytime soon.
Oh, interesting. So is Amanda comparing those patterns like with both types of feedback as well? Okay, that's great.
Well, with she has ultrasound images of tongue shapes and acoustic signals, and she's asking, can machine learning methods detect acoustic differences between these different tongue shapes, both correct
Mm,
tongue shapes like bunched and retroflex, and then
mhm.
also error tongue shapes like the higher versus the flatter tongue shapes for distorted R sounds.
So
Stay
interesting.
tuned, that one's a work in progress.
Wow, that's amazing. Okay, let's talk about the START app and how is it aiming to make biofeedback more broadly accessible?
So I was delighted to be part at the ASHA conference that just happened last month. Delighted to be part of a panel called Better Together that was about research clinical partnerships, but it wasn't just about partnerships between researchers and clinicians. It was also about clinical knowledge translators and basically getting the word out there about research. So clinical knowledge translators, Lindsay Hochul from Rock the R was part of that panel. And she and I have developed this sort of pipeline where my lab and my collaborators are working to generate content about biofeedback, and knowledge translators are going to get that content out there to the real world. Because one of the things we talked about in the panel is that I used to think that my work was done when I published a paper, and that is not, it is not.
Who's reading it? That's what I've talked a lot about in my program right now. It's like the access to the articles, the paywalls,
Who
all of
has
those things.
time?
Yeah.
And so I think it's truly powerful to partner also because I don't have the same skill set. The skill set that I
Mhm.
have is specialized for research. I have an Instagram account which I only created because of interactions with people like Lindsay. But it makes sense to have specializations but then have partnerships. So anyway, it has been a long learning process for me to realize, okay, my work is not done when I've published a paper. And in the case of biofeedback or technology enhanced treatment, there are really two major barriers to adoption. The first one is cost, and the second one is knowledge or comfort. And so staRt was developed first and foremost to address the cost barrier to biofeedback access because the very first talk I gave at ASHA about biofeedback was back in 2012 or 2013, and I was really excited to share what we had found. Biofeedback can really help your R kids. And the first question was, how much does the software cost? And we were using the K-Pentax CSL, and if you get just the software package, it costs $2,000, and if you get the hardware, it costs $5,000, $7,000. And it was clear that was a non-starter. So everyone who had attended our talk felt like, that's cool, but it's not relevant to me. And I did not have a fix for that in the moment, but I'm actually super fortunate to be in a very interdisciplinary collaborative setting here at NYU, and I was able to team up with a music technologist, Taehong Park, in our program in music technology, who had experience with acoustic visualization in the context of like electronic music performance, very totally different world from speech pathology, but he had already coded this type of real-time spectrum display. And so we were able to get some internal funding and then some external funding, and in 2020 we released the staRt app in the iPad App Store as a free download because my vision for staRt has always been just to have impact, make this biofeedback line of research impactful. And I know that it's not going to be if SLPs can't get their hands on tools for biofeedback. So staRt can be downloaded from the iOS App Store for free. We also have a web version at bitsubstart.com. And I think, and you can see on the slide there are instructions for how to find it in the iOS App Store. Don't search for it on an iPhone. It's not sized for iPhone, and so it won't show up in the iPhone App Store. And also, unfortunately, it's not compatible with a Mac computer. Even if you have the sort of newer chip, it won't run successfully on a Mac. So it's for iPad. And then we're pivoting our focus to the web version as something that's going to be more flexibly available for different types of devices. Right now, the web version is still a prototype at bitsubstart.com. You're going to want to use it in the Chrome browser, not in a different browser. And it's not mobile size, so you want to use it on a laptop or desktop computer. Our team is really working to fill in the gaps in our coverage, but well, like I said in my disclosure, grant funding is getting harder and harder to come by. And so we've been sort of trying to think creatively about ways to keep this tool supported. Because something that I learned, I'm not an engineer, I did not know this going in, but when you develop a piece of software, you can't just put it out in the world and then leave it to fend for itself. It has to be updated because there are bug fixes, but also Apple can release a new iOS that your software is not compatible with, and so software developers have to be part of the project at all times to maintain that compatibility and improve the app, fix the bugs, and give people a good user experience. So we're trying to find our way to a sustainable model that will allow us to continue to make biofeedback broadly and affordably available, but we are exploring commercialization because we're not in a moment in the federal funding landscape where it's likely for us to be able to pull down continuous grant funding to support that software. It's not stopping me from writing grants all the time, but we're exploring different directions.
Wow. Yeah, I know there's so many things on the back end that you don't realize. Like you just want to create something that's going to be helpful for people, and then Apple doesn't understand when they change their iOS platform and whatnot.
Exactly. You have to feed it. You have to take care of this thing that you created. I have been heard saying that I only have one child because I also had a piece of software. And between the kid and the dog and the software, I am fully expended in terms of my bandwidth.
That's so funny. Yeah, it's a business, your business baby. So first of all, who is the target audience? Is it clinicians? Can parents use it? What is the goal?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I want to remember to get back to my second bullet point where I said there are two barriers. One is cost and one is training. But the current version of the staRt app is geared towards SLPs because the visual that we have, the real-time spectrum, is a little bit off-putting to people who don't have training, say in phonetics. And I actually give SLPs a ton of credit because a lot of people look at the wave that we use for biofeedback and they say, I don't know what that is. It's technical. I don't like it. SLPs generally will say like, oh, okay, but tell me what it is. And then if I can use it, I'll use it. So SLPs are actually willing to overcome that initial scary looking tech thing. Okay, but if it's going to help my R kids, I will learn what it is. Parents, I think, may just opt out of that because they haven't taken a class in phonetics. They don't know what's going on here. They don't necessarily feel empowered. If a parent does want to try it for home use, we say yes to that. We also don't restrict who downloads the app. But when people email me and say, hey, is it okay if a parent downloads this for home practice? I say yes, and I feel good about it if there's an SLP in the mix who feels that the kid understands the wave. And then I would say, sure, go ahead, use it for home practice. We are trying to make the app home practice friendly, but we think it's going to mean either simplifying the visual display so it isn't quite so techy, or integrating some sort of AI feedback so that the parent doesn't feel like they need to be the expert on what is a correct R sound and what is a distorted R sound. But right now, really, the intended user is an SLP and a kid working on R. And actually, that I said this has been like a multi-year learning process for me. Another thing that I had to learn because I live in a research bubble is that no, treatment doesn't always happen in a dyad of a clinician and a child. In the schools, it's generally going to be a group of kids. And so some of the things about the way the app is configured, it pushes you to put the child in a profile because we were thinking that everything was going to be happening one-on-one. But then if you're in a group, then that profile, the location of the visual target for the staRt app is actually set by the profile. And then it only recently became apparent to me that, hey, that doesn't work well for all of the SLPs who are using this with a group because different kids may have different target locations, and then the SLP isn't going to want to switch profiles for every turn that the child takes in whatever game they're playing. So we have a workaround for that, which is if you go to the BitsUp staRt website, there is an SLP info tab, and that actually has just a little printable table of, or well, you could take a screenshot of it, a table of the target locations of where you would put our target slider for children of different ages and sexes. And so that can be a quick reference for SLPs who are working in a group and want to be able to maybe move the starfish around to different targets. And this is information that we're taking into consideration as we move forward, as we're improving the app. We've learned a lot about how people use it in the real world.
That's great that you're making those adjustments. So when the SLP is using the app, what should they be tracking data-wise? Like they may be tracking use of the strategy and the queuing, but then what can they make a goal and what should they be tracking in terms of the visual acoustic feedback?
If I go back to what I was saying when we talked about the randomized control trial, there's the acquisition. In motor learning, there's the initial acquisition of a motor plan of a new way of moving your articulators to produce the sound a different way. And then there's generalization. And we usually structure our sessions in a two-phase way where there's an initial phase of pre-practice that is that really highly interactive back and forth between the client and the clinician. And that's a great context to use the free play mode of biofeedback where it's just the wave and you can prompt the client to sustain an sound, or maybe they have some facilitative context, maybe R is helpful for them, and just give them all of those verbal articulator placement cues and encourage them to look at the biofeedback display and try to get in that motor plan, get in set to produce their more on-target motor plan. Then for kids who have found that motor plan, there's actually a quest mode in the staRt app. And if you click on quest mode, it will let you set a target number of trials, and then it will present words. You can select which variant of R you want, like vocalic or consonantal with front or back vowels, and so on. And then it will present words. We have a built-in word list, and the clinician can score it on screen. And the kid gets little reinforcers. They get a little stack of coins as they produce the trials, which is rewarding for some kids. And then it will track, it will give you the accuracy, the overall number of trials that were scored correct within that session. So we feel like at the start of the session, use the free play, lots of interactive back and forth. As they're working on generalization, move into that structured practice with the quest mode. You can do your scoring there. And also, there's an option to pause the biofeedback wave in order to give kids that opportunity to practice without biofeedback, because we have really found that is important to give them a robust motor plan that they're going to take away with them, as opposed to being dependent on the visual display.
Okay, thank you for explaining that. I think if I go in and explore it a little bit more too, I could see like what the clinician's actually looking at, what the client is looking at in terms of the feedback. I'm trying to rack my brain for what it looked like when I was back in grad school, but it sounds like you have some nice modes too to make it a little more user friendly too for SLPs.
And actually, just to close the loop on that last slide where I was saying there are two barriers, cost barrier and knowledge barrier, I have learned so much from being on Instagram, talking with clinicians who are using the staRt app. There are a lot of things that I thought were clear that people just, they're just not clear. In fact, quest mode is one of the things, most people have never tried quest mode on the staRt app, and I was like, well, it's right there, but just because it's there doesn't mean people use it. Just because I publish an article doesn't mean that people read it. And going back to the collaboration that I mentioned with Lindsay Hochul, I'm really trying to get better training materials out there so that folks know what are the options within staRt, what are the things you should be trying, and then what are the things that I thought were obvious that aren't obvious, sort of common pitfalls and sources of confusion. And so if you look on my Instagram, then I've made a number of videos explaining common questions about staRt, like where do I put the slider, or what do the peaks represent, or what are good cues to give while using staRt. And then Lindsay from Rock the R and I are collaborating on a video series that's really demystifying the staRt app, trying to help people who get that initial, oh, I don't know what it is, it looks techy, I didn't like my speech science class, this isn't for me, and help people feel like actually it really can be for you. It doesn't have to be complicated, because we see kids who get it, who are able to, they play around with their voice, they say, oh, and they see that the wave is moving, and they say, okay, all right, I'll try different things and I'll see what I can do to get my wave to line up with the target. And it doesn't have to be scary, but also I needed to reach that realization that, hey, these things aren't perfectly obvious, and so let's actually be more explicit about getting that information out there.
Yeah, well, that's very much appreciated. And you had asked me in the beginning, or you had noted that a lot of our episodes cover so many different topics. And that is essentially like why we do this and why I ask such like basic level questions. And I think a lot of our listeners really appreciate it because this may be an area that they're just going into the first time. They maybe just got out of grad school, or we may have someone who's been listening, who have been an SLP for 30 years and it has been working on the R, but has never been able to help those kids that have that residual distortion. We have like the full gamut of listeners here. So I appreciate you answering all of my questions and understanding that like we have such a range of people listening.
Absolutely.
So, where are you hoping to go with the next stage in biofeedback research?
So the team that I mentioned previously, the collaboration with Syracuse University and Montclair State University and NYU, we were fortunate to have our NIH grant renewed, and so we're running a follow-up randomized control trial that compares visual acoustic biofeedback when it's delivered in person versus via telepractice. And telepractice was something that we got really interested in during the pandemic, like everybody else, but I also think that it is a growing and important part of our profession, especially as we're looking at things like squeezing of funding for special education. I think that we're going to be seeing ongoing growth in telepractice service delivery. And so during the pandemic, we had no choice. We had to look at whether biofeedback could be done via telepractice. And we ran a couple small scale trials during the pandemic, and we found, yeah, it looks like this can work. Because it wasn't obvious that it would, because maybe there's going to be too much of a lag for the child to use the feedback display, or the connection's going to drop too much and nobody's going to learn anything. But those preliminary studies were promising enough that we are now running this randomized control trial to determine whether the effects of visual acoustic biofeedback are equally strong via telepractice compared to in person. And the one thing that is noteworthy about that trial is that we switched from using the CSL SonoMatch, which was the visual acoustic biofeedback tool in our previous study, the previous randomized control trial, and now we're using the staRt web app.
That's great.
So that, yeah, the translation to clinical practice is going to be more direct because so few clinicians are using the CSL, but the staRt app we can make broadly available. And then
Amazing.
that study has a follow-up study. So the kids receive treatment with a clinician, either in person or via telepractice. They all get visual acoustic biofeedback. There's no traditional treatment condition. And then after they finish that course of treatment, we randomize them again to either return to their sort of previous treatment as usual, like whether that's school services or maybe they're seeing a private SLP. They go back to that, or they go back to that, plus we see them twice a week for AI-guided home practice. And so in this case, there isn't a clinician working with them. There's a student, we call them a student babysitter, making sure that they're doing what they're supposed to do, but they're not giving that active clinical feedback. The feedback is coming from a classifier called Percept that was developed by Nina Benway at Syracuse University in collaboration with Jonathan Preston at Syracuse University, and drawing on the Percept corpus of speech that was collected by our whole collaborative team, NYU, Montclair, and Syracuse University. And we think that there is a lot of need for tools that can increase intensity of speech practice. Going back to the school setting, kids are being seen in groups. How many trials do they get in a single session? The literature recommends at least 100. That is just not feasible in so many cases. And okay, what can we do to help these kids make progress? Well, if we had tools, AI tools, that can extend SLP services, not replace, no one's saying replace, but extend SLP services and get that dosage in, then we might see these kids improve faster. And so this study is a first look at, does SLP guided treatment followed by AI guided treatment help kids maintain their gains better compared to a return to baseline?
That's amazing. I love that you're like looking into AI and how that can support SLPs in the future and clients as a result.
I mean, everyone's talking about AI right now. It's hard not to engage, but one of the big things is that there are a lot of AI tools hitting the market right now, and they purport to accurately classify children's speech. Most of them use off-the-shelf speech recognition tools that were trained on adult speech, and they generally do not work well on child speech. And it was really important for us that the classifier that's being used was trained on child speech data collected from our decade plus of clinical studies that we've been running on children with R distortions. All of those productions have been scored by either by human experts or by a whole bunch of non-expert listeners, and we take their consensus judgment. And so it really makes a difference compared to just taking Google's speech-to-text tool and using that to give feedback, because it's not going to work well on child speakers or individuals with speech disorders.
That makes sense.
And then the other direction that we're excited about is expanding beyond the R sound. So
I was wondering. That's great news.
I never expected to spend so much of my academic career on the R sound, but it turns out it is a huge area of need, but it is not the only sound. And so we have a prototype that we are currently sharing with beta testers of biofeedback for sibilant sounds. So it's a different kind of spectrum, and it could be used to compare a typical alveolar S with a lateralized S, for example, or an interdental S. And we think that's going to be a really exciting extension of the same principles. We can apply all the same principles of motor learning that we've refined with R, we can apply to these other residual distortions, particularly affecting sibilants.
That's wonderful. I'm excited to see when that comes out. All right, so there's been a hot debate. We saved the best for last about motor control versus phonology and children's speech patterns, and I would love to hear your position on it.
Yeah, absolutely. I have to say, I feel like this debate is not really a debate. I feel like all of the parties in this conversation actually hold very similar positions, and it's just getting blown out of proportion, maybe just for social media echo chamber reasons. I'm not positive what it is, but I would say that I hold a very middle of the road perspective that motor control is extremely important in children's speech patterns, and phonology is also extremely important in children's speech patterns. And I have a couple of Instagram videos about this where one thing that I like to talk about is most SLPs get great training in phonetics, but actually very little training in phonology. And I was surprised to learn, coming from linguistics, I was surprised to learn that if I asked students in my speech sound disorders class, what does it mean to know the phonology of a language? They could not answer that question. And it's just not part of the training, but that's tricky because it's hard to understand what is phonological treatment if you don't know what it means to know a phonology. And so a couple of things that I like to say are, first of all, phonology is grammar. When people talk about grammar, they think about syntax or maybe morphology and word parts, but we also have grammatical knowledge of the sound structure of our language. And that grammatical knowledge tells us what are the sounds that make meaningful contrasts in our language, because that's something that differs across languages. You can have two sounds that are allophones of the same phoneme in one language, but be contrastive phonemes in another language. So that is not obvious. It comes from our language-specific linguistic knowledge. Secondly, how do sounds combine into syllables? So there are languages that have very restricted syllable ranges, like Hawaiian or Japanese, and then there are languages that allow lots of sounds within a syllable. English is pretty permissive. Slavic languages, Polish, will allow lots of consonant clusters. All of those are part of phonological knowledge. And then there are also phonological alternations where one sound changes into a different sound in a specific context. And I've actually argued that maybe the reason that most of us don't have a lot of really conscious awareness of phonology is that English doesn't have a lot of these obvious alternations between sounds. We do have some, like the alternation between the T and the tap sound, like in atom and atomic. That's a flap in atom and it's a T in atomic. But if you look at some other languages, like I give an example in one of my videos about French, that if a French word ends with a consonant, it's usually not pronounced unless the next word has a vowel. And then the consonant comes out when there's a following vowel. And that is a phonological alternation. The consonant is not pronounced in final position or before a consonant, but it is pronounced before a vowel. And French speakers constantly have to engage with this fact that there are two versions of their words. There's petit and petite, and it's different depending on what the following word is. So maybe we would be more tuned into the existence of phonology if we had more of those alternations. But anyway, so phonology has to exist because languages have differences in what sounds are contrastive, how do sounds combine into syllables, how do sounds interact with each other when they touch each other, or phonotactics. If it were the case that our speech patterns emerge directly from how our tongues move biomechanically, all humans would talk the same way, would have similar sound structures, in the same way that people all around the world walk the same way. Walking is biomechanical. We have a gait that is governed by our leg length and our walking speed, but it's the same thing all around the world. And Speech is not that. It is absolutely not that. We talk in wildly different ways. And that tells us that there is a linguistic component. Different languages have different sound structure. That would not be the case if motor were the only thing at play. But I am not saying that motor factors are not important in speech. What I'm actually saying is that motor factors influence phonology, but they are systematized in different ways across languages. So it is both motor and phonology. And you can actually see that really clearly in child phonology because children are building their phonological knowledge at the same time they are mastering the control of their articulators. And you get lots of these patterns in child speech like stopping or fronting where you can point to a motor basis for the pattern and say, okay, yeah, I can see why a fricative is harder to produce than a stop. And it makes sense that children would substitute stops for fricatives. But at the same time, they do it in a way that's systematic. Systematicity is the hallmark of phonology. They'll do it across different places of articulation, even though articulatorily a f and a s are very different things. And the lips and the tongue actually mature at different stages in motor development. But you'll see kids who eliminate their pattern of stopping across all places of articulation in one go. And so I think that anyone who's being honest can see that both motor control and phonology are important. And this is actually a battle that's been fought before in our field, and I don't really know why it's coming up again. So I cited one paper from 1992 saying motor control and phonology are inextricable constructs in child speech development. And I also want to say that the versions of phonology that are getting, I think, that are engaged with on Instagram are actually old versions of phonology from the 80s and the 90s. And modern research in linguistics is engaged with understanding how motor pressures shape phonology. So if we're talking about modern models of phonology, then there really is no question that motor control is important, but it's being filtered through the grammar. And what we're getting is a combination of both. You don't have to choose one. What I don't like is that clinicians are getting a message that they should feel maybe they're doing something wrong if they're using phonological approaches. And that's not the case at all. The Fay paper, the 1992 paper, basically says we do want to be integrating both of these. If you're using a phonological approach, you can also use articulator placement cues. And if you're using an articulatory approach, you might also want to call attention to contrastive phonemes because both of those are important. And so I think this question has really been asked and answered. I'm not positive why it is so hot right now, but they're both important. And that's the middle ground that I'm going to stake out and will continue to defend.
Well, it makes sense why, and I think that you explained that very clearly. So thank you for that. I am always cautious when it's like a pendulum kind of situation where it's like it's this or nothing or this or that. Like in AAC, it's always a debate about more core vocabulary, more fringe vocabulary, and it's like there's a middle ground. Like why can't it be both? It really doesn't have to be one or the other. Yeah. And it's interesting. I wonder, do you have any like hypotheses as why this article that we will share on the next page is like purporting that it's more motor? Do you think that they're completely like ignoring the research from the linguistics field and only looking at how speech pathologists are looking at phonology?
No, I think that when I read the article, I mean, I could argue with certain things in the article, but I actually think that the integrated model of phonology, this idea that motor pressures are important, but they are integrated into a phonological grammar, I think that is compatible with what that paper is finding. I think that the messaging around the paper is what I take issue with. I think that there is a lot of very black and white statements being made, and I don't think there's any need for that. I think that humans are complicated, science is complicated, findings are never black and white. I don't think it does anyone any favors to claim that findings are black and white. Maybe it will drive more clicks, but it's not helping clinicians be more effective at what they do. In fact, it's causing clinicians to really second guess themselves, and in a context when people don't have time to read the literature and really engage critically with all of these things, we don't need to be scaring people and making them think that what they're doing is outdated, because it's not. This motor is part of phonology, has been around for decades, and there's nothing new being said here. And I don't think it needs to be hyped up to the degree that it has been. The one thing that's been fascinating for me is that I post these videos now where I talk about phonology for 5 minutes, and Instagram is like, hey, that video's too long, nobody's going to watch it. And then it gets more clicks than any of my staRt stuff ever did. And I feel like staRt is very hands-on and applied, and I would think that's what people want. But people are really interested in phonology. They're interested in learning more about phonology. So for me, this has been a great opportunity to learn, hey, actually SLPs are interested in understanding what does it mean to know the phonological grammar of a language. So I'm going to continue making that content and talking about how you don't have to make a choice between motor and phonology. But I do feel like this debate has been, it's not in the spirit of what I think discourse on Instagram should be, which is about helping clinicians be more effective and helping them treat the child as a whole person. The whole person has a motor piece and a grammatical or phonological piece. And we should really be supporting clinicians in doing that, not causing them to question their judgments or feel like they are doing something that's outdated. The model of phonology that's being attacked is outdated, but that doesn't mean that child phonology doesn't exist, and it doesn't mean that phonological treatment approaches are misguided. It just means that all of these things are important, motor is important, and so is phonology.
That makes sense. Well, thank you for sharing information on that and continuing to share more information on phonology. While you were like mentioning phonology, I had taken a linguistics class, so I understood it from a linguistics perspective. But you're right, like when I was in grad school, I feel like they barely touched on it. And then even as a clinician today, I'm like, wait, what is phonological awareness again? And
Right.
what is phonology? And what are phonological approaches? And my field is AAC, so I'm even more far removed. But it's interesting hearing like you talk about it and refreshing my memory. So thank you for that.
Wonderful.
So do you want to talk about some of these resources that you've shared here?
Sure. I think I just hit the sort of greatest hits of staRt information, how to download staRt, helpful resources for using staRt, and it also has some resources you could use in traditional treatment as well if you're not using biofeedback for whatever reason. Microphones for staRt, I do recommend that staRt be used with a microphone just because, especially when you're getting started, it's hard to figure out what the peaks are doing. They seem to move too fast, they're not really clear. If you plug in a mic and hold it just a couple inches in front of the kid's face, it will make the peaks clearer and help avoid some of that initial confusion. And then I get people saying, well, I'm not a podcaster, I don't have a mic. I don't mean a $100 mic. If you have an old pair of earbuds that has the little inline mic, just plug that in and talk into it. Or I know that newer iPads don't have that mic jack. Thank you, Apple. So that link will have some that have a mic jack, some that have a USB-C jack, and I didn't select them to be the best mics in the world. I selected them because they cost $20 or less. So that's what I'm going for there. And then I added the reference and the link for the Faye article, and I think you had some other resources too. Yeah, and I think that developmental phonetics of speech production, I have one video on my Instagram that has an automation set up. So the still should have something about get the articles. So if you want that chapter about developmental phonetics of speech production, you'll see that the whole first half of the chapter is about exactly what this articulatory study, the study that we've been talking about, is saying exactly the same thing. All of these child speech patterns have a motor basis. However, they also behave like phonology. They also are systematic. They also pattern in the same way across multiple sounds. And so you really have to reach this conclusion that it's both.
Thank you for explaining that. So we have your most recent article or the randomized control trial on the top. And since it is a randomized control trial, it is a high level 1B, according to Donahue and Cox. And then we included the other article that's also newer that talks about that motor basis. And I didn't know how to classify it here. So I just graded out because although it says it's a randomized controlled trial, when you actually look at the methodology, there are some questions about how they did that. Is that correct, Dr. McAllister?
Yeah, I think in general, sort of papers that are this hierarchy is really for clinical evidence where it's based on drug trials where you're applying a treatment. Is there a placebo and are they double blinded? And linguistics research, it doesn't apply. Like you're nowhere on that pyramid. And then the 2025 paper on the articulatory basis, it's hilarious. I'm looking at these two papers next to each other, the articulatory basis of phonological error patterns in childhood speech sound disorders, and then my dissertation in 2009, the articulatory basis of positional asymmetries. So we are
I know.
saying the same thing. Somehow we are being framed as team phonology and team motor, but we are saying the same thing. We are both saying articulation and phonology, and I don't understand why it's become a controversy, but I will say there is an element of deliberately stirring up conversation. But yeah, that kind of analysis where you're finding patterns within a data set, it doesn't apply to that just drug trial hierarchies. So we can just call them all sort of none of the above.
Okay. All right, great. So we have your website here and your Instagram, and hopefully that email is okay to share, and our Tassel contact information if anybody has any questions. But thank you so much, Dr. McAllister. This has been incredible, and I know it's going to be so helpful for so many SLPs.
This was wonderful. Thank you so much. I love talking about biofeedback. I love talking about phonology. So I would love it if folks give me a follow on Instagram and I will continue producing that content. And like I said, I have learned so much from just people asking me questions about the staRt app. It is how I learned that things that I thought were obvious were not clear at all. So please send me a question. Don't feel like it's a dumb question. It will help me understand what we need to change moving forward.
I love that. Well, thank you again.
Thank you so much.
Hi, Dr. McAllister. Thank you so much for joining us live.
Hi there. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you sound great.
Wonderful. Well,
Let
thank
me
you
just
so much. I'm thrilled to be part of this Q&A. Happy to discuss.
So we had a question come through in the comments, and then we also had some questions come through on YouTube and social media. So I'll start with the one that came through the comments in case that watcher or that viewer is still here. So they had asked initially when you were talking about biofeedback and ultrasound and the visual acoustic feedback, does tongue tie have to be ruled out first?
Great question. Yeah, I'm actually a big skeptic about tongue tie as an influence on R articulation in particular. And I'm going to quote my collaborator, Jonathan Preston from Syracuse University on this. So he was giving a talk and he said, when you think about tongue tie, you're thinking about limitations on range of motion. And the range of motion is not a defining characteristic of the R sound. Complexity of the tongue shape is, you can talk about maybe is there enough motor coordination to do a simultaneous like anterior constriction and narrowing of the pharyngeal space with the tongue root. But what he said was, can the child say T? If they can raise their tongue all the way to their alveolar ridge, which means that they can get the anterior elevation for R. Can they say ah? If they can say ah, that means they can pull their tongue root back far enough to say as it needs to be for the R sound. So basically, if they can say ta, then they have the range of motion for and we should be looking somewhere else to find the driving factor behind R misarticulation, because it's really not a demanding sound in terms of range of motion, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And we actually had Amy Graham on recently, another live. So if anybody missed that, we do dive into that topic quite a bit. And she says basically the same thing and goes into detail. So I'd recommend checking that out for the person that had asked and anybody else who's interested.
Great.
Okay, so another question that came through was this said, do you have any videos you can share using the app? And you did talk about the ones that you've done with Lindsay Hochul. So I imagine you're going to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I think that question has great timing because Lindsay Hochul from Rock the R has and I have been collaborating on a series of videos about making the staRt app more accessible, more user-friendly, easier to understand. And just this week, she dropped the third video in the series, which I actually think is the most valuable because the first two are kind of like getting set up. How do I install the app? They're important, but they're not like the meat of it. And then this one is about what are we looking at with the wave? How do we interpret the shape of the wave? And that is the number one most challenging thing for folks getting started with biofeedback. And so I would say go to YouTube, look for the Rock the R channel. I think you'll see right at the top, because she just posted this video, you'll see the video series, and in particular, the video on how do we interpret the wave is going to be a big value add for folks who are just trying out biofeedback for the first time.
That's great. I was trying to find the link while you were talking. I couldn't get it fast enough, but maybe we'll send it in the follow-up email.
Yeah, I have the link here. I'm not super familiar with this platform, so I don't know if I can pop it in a chat, but yeah, I think I can put a link in there right now, actually.
Perfect. And then I'll turn it into a QR code for anybody that wants to just access it quickly.
Wonderful. I'm going to put in that video 3, but of course, everyone is encouraged to start with video 1 and make sure that you have, oops, I put it in the wrong chat. Maybe you can put it in the main chat. Sorry.
That's perfect. Yeah, that's okay. I'm going to put it into a QR code and that way they can easily access it. Let's see if
Fabulous. Yeah, and big shout out to Lindsay Hochul. It's been fantastic working with her and better understanding how to communicate effectively about biofeedback and trying to get out of the lab and into the real world and better understand how to make these tools more accessible, not just in terms of getting access to them, but understanding how to use them.
Yeah, that's great that you've been able to have that partnership with her. Okay, so the next question that came through was, how do you decide when to use visual acoustic biofeedback versus ultrasound, especially when not everyone has access to ultrasound?
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, that's a question that answers itself, right? Because there are so few people. There were a number of talks at this past ASHA about ultrasound biofeedback, and people are really excited about it. But one of the talks put up a map of how, what are the known clinics that are operating with ultrasound in the US, and it was, I think maybe 6 states are covered or something. So it's a really small minority of SLPs who have access to ultrasound right now. And so we have focused on visual acoustic biofeedback in a lot of our research efforts, not because we think it's better than ultrasound, but because we know that it's more accessible than ultrasound, because we know that, yeah, ultrasound is amazing. Being able to see inside a kid's mouth and see exactly what they're doing while they're talking is extremely powerful. But I've been working on ultrasound for 10 years, a little bit more, and we keep waiting for the units to become more affordable, and maybe we're finally seeing the prices budge, but it's still in a sort of $4,000 to $5,000 range for a good quality unit, and that is just not going to be broadly accessible. So, so we think that but ultrasound and visual acoustic biofeedback have sort of strengths and weaknesses. We think that which one is more effective might depend on what type of learner you're dealing with. So for instance, a child who has trouble hearing the difference between their distortion and a correct sound might really benefit from acoustic biofeedback, because then they can see, here's what your sound looks like, here's what the target sound looks like, and it reinforces that auditory piece that they're missing. But for kids who are trying to figure out, the kids who can hear the difference between and but they don't know what to do with their tongue to get there, for those kids, we'd love to provide ultrasound. But in practice, not everybody's going to have access to ultrasound. Few people are going to have access to ultrasound. So the best we can do is give them the visual acoustic biofeedback that lets them see sort of, as they explore the articulatory space, they can see, are they moving in the right direction or are they getting further away from the target? And then pair that with really, good articulator placement cueing that's grounded in research on the phonetics of R sounds. So for instance, I mentioned my collaborator, Jonathan Preston at Syracuse University. We also have a collaboration with Elaine Hitchcock at Montclair State University. That team published a paper in 2020 that many of you have maybe heard mentioned on social media. It's Preston et al. In LSHSS, and it's about the articulatory phonetics of the R sound and talking about tongue root retraction, lateral bracing, the things that I was mentioning previously when I answered the question about tongue tie in R. And that combination of good grounded articulator placement cueing and visual acoustic biofeedback is we think the best bet that we can put in the hands of clinicians nationwide.
Thank you for sharing that. Actually, the two illustrations of who could benefit from the visual acoustic and who could benefit from the ultrasound was also very helpful. That didn't come up in our original conversation, so thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, we're working on a paper about that right now. I was just working on it today. And we did actually find evidence in the randomized control trial. So we measured everyone's sensory acuity at the start of treatment and then looked at how they responded as in relation to their sensory acuity. And we measured both auditory acuity for R versus W, and we measured their oral somatosensory acuity. Like we had this crazy task where they had to read letters with their tongue. All the kids who did the study were just like, what are we doing here? Mad scientists. But it's a test that's been around for years to measure how acute is tactile sensation with the tongue. And we found actually just what I described, that the children whose auditory acuity was weak, the kids who had trouble with the auditory perception of R versus W were the ones who responded the best to the visual acoustic biofeedback. And then the kids who conversely were weak in the somatosensory domain, they did not respond well to the visual biofeedback, because what they really needed is that, where is my tongue? What do I need to do with my tongue? And we weren't giving it to them because they were in the visual acoustic condition, not the ultrasound condition. So we are trying to build up to sort of, people like to talk a lot right now about precision medicine, and we would love to sort of be able to personalize speech therapy so that we measure a child's sensory profile and then say, oh, you look like you're going to respond best to this type of biofeedback. But in practice, like I just said, ultrasound needs to get a lot cheaper before we can really do that. But let's lay the framework and then see how the technology evolves.
That's awesome. That's really cool. Thank you for sharing that. All right. Another question that came up was, what are some common mistakes SLPs make when first using biofeedback for R, and what should they avoid?
Yeah, I think I would frame that not as what are common mistakes, but what are things that we need to explain better in the app, or make more user-friendly in the app. Because there are two that come to mind right away. The first one is just about when we're talking about where the peaks should appear in the app, a lot of the time I say you need to move the third peak down. And what I mean is down in frequency, but the frequency axis on the spectrum is a left to right axis. So when I say down, I actually mean left. And now I'm probably pointing right. I'm not certain if you're seeing my left as left. But folks here move the peak lower, and they think make the peak flatter, like in the vertical dimension. But I actually mean move it over towards the left to be closer to the slider. And we've been sort of workshopping different ways of talking about that. And just recently we hit on what you'll see actually in the Rock the R video, in Lindsay's video about interpreting the wave. Instead of saying move the third peak lower, it says move the third peak, or the second and third peaks should actually frame the target slider. And that captures two things. It tries to get away from this confusion about what is lower And then it also tries to give more credit to the second peak, because all of our messaging in the app so far has been around the third peak. And it's true that the third peak is key, but the second peak is also important. And it's more common than I realized for kids to have a third peak that's in about the right place, but the second peak is way too far to the left. And so that's why we came up with this wording: the second and third peaks should frame the slider. And that kind of captures all of the key components in one, hopefully easy to interpret statement.
Okay, thank you for sharing that. And while you were talking, I was like, let me see if I can bring the site up for people to kind of see, what you're referring to. But this is
Yeah.
the web version of it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to put allow all visiting site. Okay, so there's our waveforms, right?
There we go. Yeah, exactly. And so this is great to have. So the peaks in the wave-like shape should represent formants or resonant frequencies of the vocal tract. The white lines are there to help you find the peaks. And then I don't know if it's going to respond to me over Zoom, but if I say oh yeah, it got there eventually. Let's see if I do it distorted, like so if you count 1, 2, 3 peaks there, and actually, are you able to click the little camera button that's over by the, well, I'm going to sustain that and yeah, so now there's a trace, there's a little ghost wave in the background, and if you count the peaks in that little ghost wave, there's 1, 2 beneath the slider, and then the third wave is really what I used to say high up. It's a high frequency, but it is too far to the right. And so we want to take that and we want to move the third peak over to the left until it kind of meets up with the second peak. And then I don't know if you could see at the end, but the second and third peaks, we're really framing the slider there. I'll do it again. And then sometimes they actually merge together. The second and third peaks merge into one peak. And that's fine. That just means they've gotten so close together that the signal processing can no longer detect any separation between them. And we tell the kids it's fine if there are only 2 peaks, as long as that second peak is right near the slider or below the slider. But the one problem we were running into is that some kids will do a kind of like that ends up with a third peak in mostly the right place. It wasn't going through over the mic right now, so I can try to point folks to a video that I've done about that instead. But for that particular distortion that I would say is more like a gargly R sound, sometimes the third peak looks like it's lined up with the slider, but then the second peak is way off to the left, close to the first peak. And then we need to tell those kids, okay, you need to move that second peak up. So the insight that that came from talking to SLPs who are using this with actual kids in the real world was that, yeah, it's not enough to say third peak, third peak, third peak. You also have to bring the second peak to the table. And so that's why we've got this frame the slider wording.
Awesome. Oh, I'm so glad we were able to bring that up, because I feel like that was really helpful to see in real time.
I agree.
Thank you for that little demo. Well, I think that was all of the questions that we got. And I know we're a little bit over, but thank you for those of you who stayed on for the Q&A. I hope you thoroughly enjoyed this free webinar from Dr. McAllister. It is also available for 0.1 ASHA CEUs through Tassel. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us or just check out the website and you should find the information to earn ASHA CEUs there. But thank you so much, Dr. McAllister, for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks to everyone who's joining. I am always happy to talk about biofeedback and phonology and all things R. So really appreciate the invitation.
Have a great night, everybody. Oh, it looks like we got a comment before we go. Oh, I just see a thank you. Okay, that's it. Just wanted to make sure I wasn't missing anything. All right, bye, everybody.